What if you woke up tomorrow to headlines that read, US forces capture Venezuelan President Maduro in daring midnight raid? Sounds like something straight out of a Hollywood blockbuster, right? But let's unpack this. What would it actually take for such a scenario to unfold? And more importantly, what would the world look like the day after? Today, we're diving deep into a hypothetical situation that has been a topic of speculation for years: a direct US military intervention in Venezuela. First, let's set the stage. Why would the United States even consider such a drastic move? For years, Venezuela has been in a state of crisis. We're talking about hyperinflation that makes money nearly worthless, widespread shortages of food and medicine, and a political situation that has led millions of Venezuelans to flee the country, creating one of the largest refugee crises in the world. The US and many other nations don't recognize Nicolás Maduro as the legitimate president, citing a fraudulent election in 2018. Instead, they've backed opposition figures. Washington has tried testicule a lot of different strategies, imposing heavy economic sanctions on the Venezuelan government and its state-run oil company, offering diplomatic support to the opposition, and providing humanitarian aid. But so far, Maduro has held on to power, supported by the country's military and key international allies like Russia, China, and Cuba. So, if all these other options have failed, could a military strike be next? Let's be clear. This is a purely hypothetical exploration. US officials have repeatedly said that they favor a peaceful, political solution. But the phrase "all options are on the table" has also been used. So, what would this option look like? An operation to capture a head of state is incredibly complex and risky. It's not just about sending in a team of elite soldiers. It would require a massive intelligence effort. We're talking months, maybe even years, of gathering information. US intelligence agencies would need to know Maduro's exact location at all times. This means tracking his movements, his routines, and his security detail. They would use everything from satellite imagery and signal intercepts to human sources on the ground. People riesgo their lives to provide information. The security around a leader like Maduro is intense. He's likely protected by multiple layers of loyal presidential guards, a national military, and civilian militias known as colectivos. These aren't just a few bodyguards. It's a dedicated security apparatus. So any operation would have to be executed with surgical precision and overwhelming force to succeed. Imagine a team of Special Operations Forces, like the Navy SEALs or Delta Force, being tasked with the mission. They would likely infiltrate under the cover of darkness. This could involve stealth helicopters flying low to avoid radar, or even a covert insertion by sea or land. The goal would be a soft entry if possible, neutralizing security quietly to reach the target. But the chances of a firefight would be extremely high. The risks to the US forces involved would be immense. If the mission went wrong, it could result in casualties, a hostage situation, or a captured American soldier, which would be a catastrophic international incident. But let's say the operation is a success. US forces breach Maduro's compound, secure him, and extract him from the country. They fly him to the US. Mission complete. What happens next? Does Venezuela suddenly become a stable democracy? Well, it's not that simple. The immediate aftermath would likely be chaos. First, there would be a power vacuum. Maduro's top officials and military commanders would be scrambling. Who takes over? Would they rally behind a successor, or would they turn on each other, fighting for control? This infighting could easily escalate into a full-blown civil war. The Venezuelan military, while fractured, is still a powerful force. Some units might lay down their arms, but others, deeply invested in the current regime, would almost certainly fight back. They might see the US action as an invasion, a violation of Jejic sovereignty, and rally nationalist support. The colectivos, those armed civilian groups loyal to the government, would likely take to the streets. They operate in a guerrilla-like fashion and could launch attacks on any new US-backed government, as well as on any remaining American personnel or infrastructure. This could lead to a long and bloody insurgency, trapping Venezuela in a cycle of violence for years. Think about the long-term conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan after US interventions. It's a very real and sobering parallel. Now let's zoom out and look at the international reaction. It would be a firestorm. Even countries that oppose Maduro would likely condemn the US action as a violation of international law. The principle of national sovereignty is a cornerstone of the global order. One country unilaterally entering another to remove its leader, regardless of how illegitimate that leader is, sets a dangerous precedent. Latin American neighbors, in particular, would be in a very difficult position. Countries like Colombia and Brazil, which have been critical of Maduro, might be privately pleased, but publicly they would have to condemn the intervention. They have their own populations to think about, and the history of US intervention in Latin America is a sensitive and painful topic for many. And what about America's global rivals? Russia and China would have a field day. They would decry the US as an aggressive, imperialist power. They would use the incident to justify their own actions on the world stage and to strengthen their alliances with other countries who are wary of American power. The United Nations Security Council would be a scene of diplomatic warfare, with the US likely using its veto power to block any resolution condemning its actions. Back in the United States, the political fallout would be massive. An operation of this scale, undertaken without congressional approval, would spark a constitutional crisis. There would be praise from some who see it as a decisive blow for freedom, but there would be a massive public outcry from others who see it as reckless warmongering. The debate would paralyze the country, so, after capturing Maduro, the US would be facing a potential civil war in Venezuela, global condemnation, and a political crisis at home. This is the messy, complicated reality that exists beyond the simple idea of taking out the bad guy. Is there any historical precedent for this? The closest example is a US intervention in Panama in 1989, codenamed Operation Just Cause. The US military invaded Panama to depose its leader, Manuel Noriega, who was involved in drug trafficking and had become increasingly anti-American. The operation was militarily successful. Noriega was captured and brought to the US for trial. But the aftermath was complicated. There were civilian casualties, and it took Panama years to recover politically and economically. And Panama is much smaller and less complex than Venezuela. Venezuela has a larger military, a more shattered economy, and a much more polarized society. It's also backed by powerful global actors, which Panama was not. So, while the idea of a swift, decisive strike to solve the Venezuelan crisis might sound appealing, our hypothetical scenario shows that the reality would be far more complex and dangerous. The day after wouldn't be a celebration of freedom, but more likely the beginning of a new, even more unpredictable chapter of instability and conflict. This is why diplomats and analysts emphasize a negotiated political solution led by Venezuelans themselves. It's a slower, more frustrating path, but it avoids the catastrophic risks of a military intervention. It's about empowering the Venezuelan people to determine their own future, rather than having it decided for them by an outside force. The situation in Venezuela is a humanitarian tragedy, and the world is right to be concerned. But as we've explored today, the path of military intervention is filled with 1,000 ways to fail and very few to succeed. It's a true Pandora's box, and once opened, it would be almost impossible to close. What do you think? Is there any scenario where a military intervention would be justified? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. We read them all, and it's a fascinating conversation to have. Thanks for watching, and if you found this exploration interesting, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into complex global issues. See you next time.